Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. Today, on October 10th, 2022, we're going to be talking about the secret city. Which city is the secret city, you may ask, and why is it the secret city? Well, it's Washington, D.C. In this book about homosexuality, secrecy, national security, and oppression all blended into one, James Kirchick, who I'm excited to have on the podcast today, is studying this previously unstudied section of American history, and we're introduced to so many individuals that you've probably never heard of, even though they were at the heart of American policy, like foreign policy specifically. And they were serving their country while they were living double lives. It's something that I can't even imagine as a 19-year-old American, but this happened. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Juliette.
So before we get started, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Related to my book, I'm assuming, or you just think in general?
Generally.
Are you asking? I'm gonna try to tie it to my book because that's why I'm here, right? It's from my book.
Awesome.
And I think it might actually be true in general, which is that really up until quite recently, there was no worse thing you could be in American politics. And I would actually say maybe even in America than a homosexual and to be gay. And that might seem really crazy for people of your generation, because if the polls are to be believed, members of your generation proclaim themselves to be LGBT at twice the rate, twice the incidence level than people of my generation, which are millennials. And being gay or queer, I guess would be the term that people your age would use, is not only considered a neutral category, like being left-handed or having a particular eye color. It's almost, I think, seen as a positive trait at this point, actually. And I think there are lots of people who adopt the identity of queer, even though they are not homosexual. In fact, the word homosexual is probably one that people of your generation aren't familiar with, by which I mean same-sex attraction. And this same-sex attraction was universally condemned within American society by all of our religious denominations, the medical establishment, certainly the political establishment. It was illegal in this country to be gay. Culturally, it was ridiculed, and gay people were treated as deviants. That was actually the term that was used to describe gay people. Certainly the word gay was not used until really the late 1960s, early 1970s. They would use the term sexual deviance. And so this is really, I think, the overriding message of my book, and it is something that I think people of your generation should understand.
And it's something that we overwhelmingly don't know. I mean, obviously, like, you're the first to write this sort of compiled history of specifically that. And it's, I don't know, it was just crazy to learn about because it overlaps in a way that really makes sense with our, like, other history, the other history being the one that's told or has been told up to this point. And so it was kind of shocking for me to realize, like, wow, there was a point. First, every time I read sexual deviant, I had a reaction to it because I was like, what? Like, sometimes I was like, what is that? Like, what do you mean? Sometimes I was like, why would they say, like, I don't know. It does a good job of, like, restating the impact that sort of thing had on other people. Like, I can't even understand, but I don't know. It was just very well written. So let's get into that. How did you come to write this book, and why did you want to write it?
Well, I'd say there are two sort of answers to that question. The first has to do with my academic background. I was I am, and I have been very interested in the Cold War and sort of all aspects of the Cold War, intellectually, kind of domestic American Cold War, the rise of McCarthyism, the neoconservative movement. I'm interested in sort of the Cold War overseas, and in the Third World, the battle between the Soviet Union and the United States, and its proxy wars in Latin America and Africa. I wrote my senior thesis on the Liberal Party of South Africa, which was an anti-communist, anti-apartheid political party in South Africa. Espionage fiction, I've always been interested in, and espionage movies, and just sort of the ideological battle between East and West that really shaped the second half of the 20th century. And it was at Yale that I studied under Professor John Lewis Gaddis, who's the dean of Cold War history in the United States. He's the biographer of George Kennan, the great Cold War strategist. And I was taking a seminar that Professor Gaddis was teaching on the art of writing biography, where the final paper for our class was a biography that we had to write on a figure, living or dead, whose papers were at Yale. And I was lucky in that a man named Larry Kramer had just donated his papers to Yale. Larry was a very famous, controversial, gay activist, playwright, a novelist. He was also a very influential AIDS activist. He founded the organization Gay Men's Health Crisis in his living room in New York City in the fall of 1982, which was the first, AIDS organization devoted to combating this very mysterious disease that just suddenly appeared among gay men in the summer of 1981. And Larry was still alive at the time, and I got to know him, and I interviewed him, and I worked in his papers. And this was sort of, I would say, a merging of these two interests of mine, the kind of, as I say, the open history, right, of the open city, the history of the Cold War that we all know, or that we all can read about in books. And then the secret history, which is the history of gay people in this country, which has always been, in the 20th century, certainly was kept hidden by many people. Mainstream historians did not want to write about it. Journalists would often write about it, in a kind of roundabout way. Gay people, when they were alive, would often hide this aspect of their lives, gay public figures. And if they did keep diaries about it, then often their families would, upon their death, would destroy them because it was considered so shameful. And then, so these were sort of two interests of mine, Cold War history and gay history. And then after college, I moved to Washington, and I was realizing that this was a city that was that runs on secrets. So certainly in the 20th century, secrets were a very important part of Washington. They were a form of currency, a form of power. And I was covering national security, and I realized that the more secrets you have access to, the more power you have. Because secrets are a form of power. Secrets can be used to advance yourself. They can be used to hurt other people, to take down other people. That's what the whole notion of the leak is, right? The leak. Every day there are leaks in Washington, and they are dispensed by people who have access to secrets. And as a journalist, you're constantly trying to get access to those secrets so you can be the one who breaks the story. And so I realized that there was no more powerful secret in Washington, in American politics. Nothing that could more easily destroy a political career than the accusation that someone was gay. And so this seems like a really compelling way or method of analyzing or sort of revisiting American history, and sort of beginning around World War II. I mean, the book begins really with the New Deal with FDR, and just going through this entire period of history from World War II until the end of the Cold War, looking at every president, every administration, every sort of major phenomena, from the Whittaker Chambers Alger Hiss case and the rise of McCarthyism, through to the founding of the CIA and the kind of bureaucratic battle with the FBI, the poet of Camelot, Jack and Jackie Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson and his close aides, Richard Nixon's paranoia, the rise of the African American civil rights movement, and then the Reagans and Reagan's America and the AIDS crisis, and then just sort of revisiting all these episodes and personalities and characters and events, and trying to explore how they were impacted by this fear of homosexuality. And I found that it was a very profound impact. It wasn't a minor one. You really can't understand this period of American history, I believe, without understanding the role that homosexuality played in all these events and with all these individuals.
Well, you know what else is crazy? I didn't learn about the Cold War in high school or middle school or elementary school. I didn't learn about it until, well, I mean, I just have picked up parts of it at different points. But really, like, your book taught me a lot about the Cold War, which is interesting. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm just in that weird gap where we're too close to the Cold War for it to be taught, but like, we weren't alive. So
no, you weren't.
It was kind of crazy to like learn about all of that. Also, like, I thought McCarthy was president. Like, I thought that's why McCarthyism was a thing. I was like, oh, he must have been president if there's a thing named after him. It's kind of a weird thing for me to conflate. I don't know. But wow, great book, great connection of ideas. It seems so obvious now that you've laid it all out, but it probably wasn't at the time. But I'm glad that you told this story.
No, it wasn't. It was something yeah. No, thank you. And I didn't really have this thesis until I started working on it. You know, I knew I wanted to write this book, and I knew that there were lots of fascinating stories to be uncovered and told, and that it would make a great sort of narrative history book. But in terms of, you know, these conclusions that I've reached, I didn't really reach them until the end of the kind of research process, until I started writing.
And I got so excited every time George Kennan was mentioned because I developed such a crush on him this summer. I took a class on U.S.-Russia relations, like Reagan to now, so like post-Cold War mostly. And I just, I don't know, like, I read one of his works. Like, I don't know how deep this crush was, but I was just excited. I was like, wow, these people were real. Also, can we call them characters if they were real people? Do you just call them characters?
Yes, you can say that. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Okay, cool. That's a point.
And if you're speaking about the context of a book in which they appear, I think that's fair to say. Okay,
nice clarification. What's super fascinating is the parallel between the secrecy that homosexuals had to have about their private lives and national secrecy, like national secrets, all of that stuff. And you go into a lot of detail and you tell the story of the evolution of how these secrets were viewed in Washington and the intersection between national security and the secret of being gay. Can you kind of talk about how that evolution occurred and how and why World War II especially was a turning point where homosexuality became kind of a national security threat?
Sure. Yes, this concept of national security is not something that even existed in our country until World War II, and really afterwards. I mean, the National Security Council was not created until 1947. The Central Intelligence Agency was founded the same year. The United States didn't have a civilian intelligence agency until World War II. It was called the Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor to the CIA, and that was founded by President Roosevelt in 1942. So prior to that, the United States was, deeply isolationist, did not want to be involved in the world. That wasn't to say we weren't. We obviously had imperial adventures overseas, but the notion of being a kind of world-bestriding power with a global presence was not something that was really in the American consciousness of our leaders until World War II. There's actually an anecdote that I tell, a rather funny one, that I came across in the diary of FDR's naval aide, John McCrae. He's walking down, this is sometime in the late 1930s, before the Second World War, and he's walking past the Corcoran Gallery, which, if any of your listeners are familiar with Washington, D.C., is an art gallery just across the street from the White House. And he sees a white piece of paper flying through the air, and he snatches it into his hand, and it says confidential document from the State Department. So the State Department used to be in the building right next to the White House, which is currently the Eisenhower Executive Office building. It used to be the Office of War, State, and the Navy. They were all housed in the same building. So that's how secrets were treated in Washington, that you could just have a confidential State Department document fly out an open window on a windy day. And the war changes that. The war completely changes that. And with it, homosexuality becomes transformed, because prior to the war, homosexuality, it was certainly a sin. It was certainly illegal in every state. And it was considered a medical condition by the medical establishment. I mean, gay people could be institutionalized, and many of them were. They could be forced to undergo lobotomies or castration and other sorts of chemical-based treatments to cure them, so to speak. But the war transforms homosexuality into a national security threat, because then the fear is generated that because gay people have this deep, dark, awful secret, as I said, the worst possible thing that you could be, that they would go to any lengths to protect that secret, including, if they happen to be a government employee in possession of, again, secret information, including perhaps giving away government secrets to adversarial foreign powers that blackmail them, or that try to blackmail them. And so gay people are become widely feared as being potential targets for blackmail. And that is when these first sort of gay political government scandals occur. They all happen after World War II. Or during once after the Second World War begins.
So let's talk about the Cold War. Obviously, maybe not obviously to me, because I was not taught about it in school, or taught it in school. The U.S. government really was obsessed with expelling communists, especially like early Cold War 40s and 50s. What I didn't realize, and what I don't think a lot of, most people probably don't know this, but homosexuality was conflated with communism. And I mean, as you mentioned earlier, oftentimes it was regarded as worse than communism in the middle of the Red Scare. So how did these two ideas get intertwined?
So there are several factors. There's the specific example of the Alger Hiss Whittaker Chambers case, which I referred to earlier, which is the first real big spy drama of the American Cold War. And it involved a former high-ranking State Department official named Alger Hiss, and a man who accused him of being a communist spy named Whittaker Chambers. Chambers, at the time he made these accusations in 1948, was a very well-known and well-regarded journalist at Time magazine. And he alleged that about 10 years earlier, in the 1930s, that he and Hiss had been members of the same communist cell in Washington when Chambers was working as a courier, he claimed, basically taking stolen State Department documents that Alger Hiss gave him and sending them to Moscow. And these accusations were explosive and riveting. It was the first televised congressional hearing in the United States. It was before the House Un-American Activities Committee, which would become infamous. And underlying this drama between these two men was this homoerotic component. Because Chambers had actually, at the same time that he was a member of the Communist Underground, he'd also lived a gay life as well, having sex with men. And this was rumored at the time, and he actually confirmed it in a confidential interview to the FBI. He sort of warned them about this, that he had lived a life as a homosexual, and that the Alger Hiss forces might try to use this at some point to discredit him. This never became public during the trial. It was too explosive. The Hiss forces considered it too risky to make the accusation public. But what they did was they sort of quietly spread the word, the rumor, that Whittaker Chambers was a spurned homosexual, that he had lusted after Alger Hiss, and that the reason he was making these accusations that Hiss was a communist was because he was bitter that Hiss had rejected him. And this comes up a lot when you read, it's sort of hinted at or inferred if you read some of the press coverage at the time. There are references to this ghastly accusation, this horrible, unspeakable slander that was leveled by the Hiss forces against Whittaker Chambers. And he himself, in his great memoir, Witness, Chambers, alludes to it, but you can't name it, again, because it's this terrible thing that can't be named. But this sort of begins to associate in many prominent people's minds this association between treason, homosexuality, and communism. And then it gets a real boost 2 years later in 1950, when Joe McCarthy makes his famous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia. He was speaking to the Republican Ladies Club, and he alleged that there were 205 members of the Communist Party working in the State Department, card-carrying members. And he claimed to have their names. He waved a list in his hand. And this sets the country afire. It becomes the biggest news story. It's on the front pages of every paper in the country. And a couple of weeks later, the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, is summoned to Capitol Hill to testify about these charges. And he brings with him a deputy Undersecretary of State, John Puerafoy, who's being questioned about the supposed presence of, communists in the State Department. And he mentions in passing that 91 homosexuals had actually been fired from the State Department in the previous 3 years. And this becomes a huge scandal. And in fact, a newspaper reporter would later write that of the tens of thousands of letters that Joe McCarthy received in the months following these revelations, that only 25% of the letters were primarily concerned with communists in the State Department, and that the vast majority were taken up with the threat posed by sexual deviants. And there begins to sort of cohere in the public imagination the image of the homosexual villain. And he's a communist, he's a homosexual, he's a sexual deviant. Both communists and homosexuals are secret people. They live in the shadows. They are subversive, right? The communists are politically subversive, and homosexuals are sexually subversive. They're both basically, against American motherhood, the flag, and apple pie. And so these two groups of people become conflated. The communists are seen as homosexuals, and homosexuals are seen as communists. There's another case that becomes public that also, I think, further cements this. It involves a man named Guy Burgess, who was a British diplomat and spy, who was also working as a spy for the Soviets. He had been stationed in Washington in 1950 and 1951, and then he fled the country for Moscow with another British diplomat, Donald MacLean. And Burgess was gay. He was actually quite open about it for the time. And he was a communist. And sort of this singular figure of Guy Burgess became, he sort of added sustenance to this stereotype. So you have, a couple of isolated cases, right, involving spies, communists, gays. You have McCarthy's allegations. You have the fact that gay people had been in the State Department, and a number of them had been expelled simply for being gay. And this is all happening at a time of great sort of moral panic in the United States during a Red Scare. And so it's a kind of a conflation of events and phenomena that collide into one another. And it just becomes a very dangerous time to be gay in Washington.
So, yeah, what were the consequences of the mix of these ideas?
Well, the most tangible one was the numbers of gay people, or just people suspected of being gay, who were expelled from the government or denied service in the government. In April 1953, Dwight Eisenhower, the newly elected president, he signs an executive order. It's one of the first executive orders he signs that prohibits gay people from working anywhere in the federal government. You have to understand, the federal government at this time was huge. And it wasn't just the federal government that gay people were banned from working in. It was also federal contractors, any private business that contracted with the federal government. And this is the Cold War, right? So you have these massive defense contractors, the United States. And the United States federal government is growing at an enormous pace. So you have the rise of the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower would later condemn in his farewell speech. And this entire bureaucratic edifice is, at this point, constitutionally opposed to hiring gay people. It is committed to rooting them out, investigating them, finding them, and expelling them. And it's estimated that 7,000 to 10,000 gay people were fired in the 1950s alone. In these policies that I write about in the book, they extended until 1975 in terms of the civil service, and then until 1995 in terms of any security clearances. So gay people could not have a job that required a security clearance, so they could be prohibited from having a job that required a security clearance until 1995. And they could be prohibited from working in the federal government until 1975. So this long outlasts the Red Scare. I mean, the Red Scare, you could say, really ends with Joe McCarthy's death in 1957. I would actually argue it ends a couple of years earlier, because he's really, with his censure at the end of 1954, right? So these policies were longer lasting than the Red Scare. And I would argue that they were actually more damaging, because unlike the Red Scare, which was at least based on a real, genuine fear of communism, we were right to be afraid of communism. We were right to oppose communism. It was an evil ideology that had an enormous amount of blood on its hands and still does. It was obviously exaggerated by the likes of McCarthy, and innocent individuals, their lives were destroyed by these policies. But it was at least based on a real fear. And as I mentioned earlier, there were actually a number of communists in the federal government. Alger Hiss was a communist. Whittaker Chambers was right about him. The Lavender Scare, which is what the purge of gay men and women is called, that was based on nothing. I mean, there was no evidence at all that gay people posed a threat to the federal government, to national security. There was not a single case of a gay person being blackmailed into revealing confidential information to a foreign power. So I would actually argue that the Lavender Scare was worse. It was more egregious than the Red Scare.
So wait, so why were there so many gays in the State Department specifically? Is that just because that's the focus of the book?
No, they're actually, well, I don't have the statistics to prove this, but sort of anecdotally and from my research, I think it's fair to say that the State Department provided, particularly for gay men, because look, if you were a woman, you were not going to get a job as a diplomat or as a high-ranking official or an ambassador. Women didn't start really achieving getting those sorts of jobs in the State Department until the 60s or 70s, right? So before World War II and even after, if you were a gay man, then the State Department could be a pretty attractive career. I mean, let's think. You can work overseas, perhaps in countries that have more lenient attitudes towards or relaxed attitudes towards homosexuality. You can pretty much get away with being a bachelor without people being suspicious, right? You're constantly moving from post to post overseas. It's difficult to have a wife and family. So that was another reason why it could be attractive for gay men. And it was also an all male environment. So there were a number of pretty high ranking gay men actually in the State Department before the war. And I write about some of them. And they're able to sort of get away with it. It's not until really 1947 that the crackdown begins. And the State Department has this, it achieves a kind of cultural reputation as being a haven of homosexuals because it is blamed as part of the McCarthyite charges, the McCarthyite campaign. It's the State Department that is blamed for America sort of losing in the early years of the Cold War, right? We lose China to the communists. Eastern Europe is falling to Soviet control and influence. And McCarthy alleges, the basis of McCarthyism is this belief that the American elite in the State Department, consciously sold out America, that there were high class, well-educated members of the elite who were traitors. It's not that these were forgivable mistakes or that the communists were more powerful. It's that there were traitors in high office. And part of this accusation is that they're weak. They're not strong. They're weak, effeminate men who, couldn't put up a fight against these muscular, masculine, tough communists. And so you have these epithets that are used to describe diplomats, that they're cookie pushers, which is a term, right? That they're kind of pushing cookies on a table in their sort of diplomatic quarters. And so diplomacy gets conflated with effeminacy, and effeminacy is conflated with homosexuality. And so the State Department is seen as this repository of effete homosexuals. And there's a cartoon that is published in the summer of 1950 in the New Yorker magazine, by no means a right-wing publication. And it shows a man applying for a job, and he's telling the other man on the other side of the desk who's thinking of hiring him, he says, "Yes, it's true, sir. I was fired from the State Department, but only for incompetence." Right? So it's clearly understood in the American zeitgeist that the State Department at this point has basically become synonymous with homosexuality.
And so I got the impression that gay women were not as affected as men were by the views of homosexuality. And I mean, it seems like it makes sense, like women weren't working in the State Department as much. Do you think that that's the full explanation, or is there another reason why?
It's part of the reason. I mean, the other reason is that this was a patriarchal society, and men were considered more important than women were in every realm of life. And so therefore, male sexuality in all of its forms was considered more important than female sexuality, and therefore male homosexuality was considered a greater threat than female homosexuality, right? Because men are supposed to be leading our society. They're supposed to be the bosses. They are the the breadwinners. They're earning the money. They're leading our country. They're leading our businesses. They're leading our Defense Department, our State Department, right? And so if they are homosexual and they are corrupted by these deviant practices, then it's just a greater problem. And this is not just unique in America. The Nazis did not outlaw female homosexuality. Which is not to say that lesbians were not oppressed under Nazism, but not nearly in the same numbers, and they were not rooted out, and they were certainly not, killed in the numbers that male homosexuals were in Nazi Germany. Great Britain never outlawed female homosexuality. It never outlawed lesbianism. Same-sex relations between women were never outlawed in the United Kingdom. They were outlawed among men. And it was ruthlessly enforced. I mean, many, many men, tens of thousands of men were imprisoned in the 20th century in Great Britain for homosexual offenses. And that didn't end until 1967. And then furthermore, male homosexuality was such that it often was in conflict with the law, by which I mean, if you were a gay man in the 1950s and you wanted to meet other gay men, there was no grinder. There weren't really many places that you could go other than kind of seedy bars or public restrooms and public parks. The practice of cruising, right, which means searching for other sexual partners in public places. This was fairly common. If you were a sexually active gay man, this is how you would meet other men like yourself, and that was very risky. One of the prime cruising ground in Washington during the early years of the Cold War was Lafayette Square, which is the main park right across the street from the White House, which I think says so much about my book, right? That you have the main meeting ground for these secret citizens was the park directly across the street from the home of the most powerful man in the world. And dating back to the late 19th century, there are police reports of them, arresting men seeking out sexual encounters with one another at night in Lafayette Square. And so gay men were just coming into conflict with the police at a much, much higher rate than lesbians. Lesbians were not meeting each other in these ways. Lesbians were not searching for sex in public parks or public restrooms. That's not how lesbians then or now. that's not how lesbians socialize. So gay male socialization practices and sexual, the kind of sexual ecology of the gay male in this period of time was such that he was at greater risk of running into the law.
So I'm going to ask a really big question, but maybe a little bit more brief. I know it's going to be hard, but how did these changes in gay rights and the culture and the attitudes, how did that come about?
Well, that's a good question, and there's several answers to it. This goes to one of the overarching themes of the book, which is secrecy and its opposite, which is transparency. And so as long as gay people were secret, as long as no one knew, as long as there were no openly gay people, as long as homosexuality was just a sort of idea that existed in people's imaginations, then people could believe the most frightening, horrible things about gay people. They could believe, as I write in the book, that gay people were more predisposed to fascism and that the Nazis were a gay cabal. This was actually speculated upon at length in numerous government reports that I cite in the book. Or during the Cold War, they could believe that gays were communists. They could believe, as was alleged in 1967 by the district attorney in New Orleans, Jim Garrison, that the assassination of President Kennedy was organized by a right-wing gay cabal. This was actually the only man ever tried legally for the assassination of President Kennedy. Was a gay businessman named Clay Shaw living in New Orleans. And his prosecution, which was completely reckless and without basis, forms it inspired the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, which was a multiple Academy Award winning film. So people could believe all sorts of nasty, crazy, conspiratorial nonsense about gay people as long as they were in the closet. And then once gay people started coming out of the closet, and because of the fact that gay people are randomly distributed across the population, by which I mean there are poor gay people, there are rich gay people, there are white gay people, black ones, Asians, rural, city. They come in all shapes and sizes in every sector of society. And once gay people started coming out in appreciable numbers, simply by dint of, biological fact, everyone now in America knows a gay person. I think the latest Gallup poll or Pew showed that 94% of Americans know someone who's gay. 50 years ago, that was not the case. 50 years ago, very few people could say that they knew a gay person. Of course, they did, but those gay people were not out. They were living secret lives. And so it required some very courageous people in the 1950s and 60s to come out of the closet, to be the first, and to say that, we're not sick as gay people. It's the society that says that we're sick that is sick. It is the society that oppresses gay people and that condemns homosexuality, which is sick. And it took them a very long time and a lot of struggle, and a lot of people suffered and died and had their lives wasted and ruined because of these policies, because of the fear of homosexuality, homophobia. A lot of people suffered to get to where we are today. And that's really what I try to show in the book.
Speaking of right-wing gay cabal that assassinates JFK, so my mom had a book club with a few of her friends about your book, and she let me attend. Yes. And I got into a super interesting conversation with one of her. Yeah, it was awesome. I got into a super interesting conversation with one of her friends about the political affiliations of the gay community then and how it differs from now. I feel like usually there's kind of a stereotype, like, I don't know if I want to call it a stereotype. I don't know what I would call it, but there's this belief that like gay people are generally like on the left. But she pointed out that a majority, it seemed, were on the right in your book. Is there kind of, like, I have a theory, kind of, but I'm not the expert here. Do you have an idea as to why there was this shift, or was there really a shift?
Well, it's hard to know statistically where gay people were in their political affiliations before the 1980s, really, because no one was polling on that question, right? Mm-hmm. Very few, no one was doing random samplings of gay people, asking self-identified gay people, what is your political beliefs, like they do for other groups, women, men, blacks, Jews, Italians, right? Mm-hmm. That doesn't really start happening until the 80s. And that is also around the time that homosexuality becomes a partisan political issue. Really before that time, really before the late 1970s, homosexuality does not factor into politics beyond being a target of really everyone, Republicans and Democrats. They're all attacking gay people as national security threats and basically a problem to be dealt with. The gay rights movement, as we understand it, the modern movement, really begins to take off in the 1970s, becomes professionalized. And then you start seeing representatives in Congress. Bella Abzug, who's a famous feminist from New York, a congresswoman, she introduces the first gay rights bill. It's an anti-discrimination bill, I believe in 1974. And it's mostly Democrats and liberals who are supporting her, but there are also liberal Republicans who are supporting it as well. And you also have a couple of these, conservative Republicans who believe in individual rights and personal privacy, and they might be willing to support measures like this. But there's a backlash to the gay rights movement that takes off in the late 1970s, and it's led by a woman named Anita Bryant, who's an evangelical Christian. She's the orange juice spokeswoman for the Florida Citrus Commission, and she's also a gospel music singer. But she's also an evangelical Christian. And so this is the rise. So you have the rise of the gay rights is also simultaneous with this other movement, the rise of the evangelical Christians. And that really takes off around the late 1970s. And there are several issues that animate them. One is the desegregation of schools in the South. And they start up all these they're called Christian academies that are really just ways of skirting the desegregation. They basically become all white schools. There's obviously the abortion decision in 1973, Roe versus Wade, but also the rise of the gay rights movement. And so in reaction to these liberalized and the rise of the feminist movement too, right? So in reaction to these liberal movements, these expressions of individual rights in various ways, you have a reaction in the form of the Christian right. And they play a crucial role in helping Ronald Reagan get the presidency in 1980. And this is when homosexuality becomes more of a partisan issue. This is when you see people lining up, right? Sort of if you're liberal and a Democrat, you're more likely to support gay rights. And if you're a conservative or a Republican, you're more likely to oppose it. And that really begins in the 1980s. Before that, it's hard to know where gay people were politically. I certainly write about, I wouldn't want to leave readers with the impression that most gay people were right-wing. I think I write about them more in the book just because I find that to be sort of fascinating and more unexplored. Well, I find the tension of the gay conservative more fascinating, right? Because there was more tension involved in being a gay Republican supporter or say employee advisor in the Reagan administration. That's a really tense, fraught existence, as opposed to being, a staffer for Ted Kennedy in the 1980s. That's not a very dramatic life. I find the stories that I tell of these men, and they're mostly men, these gay men who are sort of in the orbit of the Reagans. I just find that a fascinating story, because here were men whose political convictions were directly at odds with their private lives, with their identities as gay people. Because you have a presidential administration that is heavily indebted to evangelical Christians. Then you have the onset of the AIDS epidemic, and the administration is doing its best to ignore it and not talk about it. And yet here you have these very powerful gay men who are close to the Reagans, or working in the administration, or on the outside supporting the administration. And I felt, exploring their dilemmas to be as a journalist, that, and as a historian, that interested me the most.
So I have one more question for you. What is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
I used to be, I would say, pretty much 100% open borders guy. And I would say the past few years have forced me to reckon with my pro-immigration views. I'm still pro-immigration. I think immigrants are generally good. They're generally a net positive. But I would say that I've been somewhat chastened, perhaps, in my belief that immigration is an unmitigated good. And also my belief that, or my realization perhaps, that immigration policy really needs to be tied to the democratic process. I think this kind of populist wave that we've been seeing across the Western world is largely driven by an aversion to mass immigration. And I think the reason we've had this backlash is that we haven't taken into consideration enough the views of the public, and that immigration policy was something that was largely decided by elites without the consent of the public, or without their input, and without really caring what they thought about it. And it's come back to bite us in the form of Donald Trump being elected in 2016, and a lot of these nationalist, authoritarian-leaning leaders across the Western world. I think it's what brought Brexit. You look at Marine Le Pen in France, you look at Viktor Orban in Hungary, you look at the Alternative for Deutschland party in Germany, the kind of Eurosceptic views in general within Europe. I think it's driven by a fear of mass immigration. And I think I used to be more sanguine about the possibilities of mass immigration, and I've grown more I don't know if I would say skeptical, but more open-minded to hearing the other side.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.